Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Amy Hammond, Senior Director of Marketing here at PARC, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you all to our first PARC Forum of 2014. Tonight we're going to be discussing time for change, cultural and brand disruption leading to innovation.
So welcome all, and thank you for coming today. We're really excited. What I wanted to do was to start this off with a quick quote from each of our panelists to let you know how excited we are here. We'll do some brief introductions, and we'll go ahead and start. Before we get going, just to set some ground rules and expectations to make this as fun and interactive event as possible, what we're going to do is we're going to speak for about 45 minutes, and then we're going to open it up for 15 minutes of questions. What we'd like to do then is go out and meet everybody in the lobby, socialize for a bit. We'll have another half an hour. Within that 45 minutes, if you still don't feel like you got your questions answered, please reach out to me or anyone on the panel. We've put our Twitter addresses up here. We're all on LinkedIn. We're all happy to try and address your questions as best possible, okay? And then one of the other things, too, is as we're going along, if you have a question and feel like there's something, some burning desire that you have, go ahead, raise your hand. I'll acknowledge you, and then when we come back to questions, I'll make sure that I call back on you so you don't have to keep your hand up the entire time. All right. So let's go ahead and start. I want to start with Michaela, and then I'm going to let Michaela introduce herself. She had this great quote when we were doing the prep, and I want to read this to you. All right, so we're all living in an era where culture and brand must be authentically one, and you can invest in millions in brand marketing, but it means nothing if the way people behave does not support your message. So I want to introduce Michaela, give you a brief background of yourself, and then talk about what you meant by that quote.
Sure. Can you all hear me? Okay, great. So I'm Michaela Stribling. I'm delighted to be here. Thank you for inviting me, Todd, and the PARC team. I work for IBM on the social business team, and I am an influencer evangelist, I guess, is what, generally speaking, I'm referred to as. That means that I spend the bulk of my time thinking about how to advance IBM's social business message to people who are having similar conversations in the market. People who, at one point in time, might have been journalists or analysts and have now moved on to basically creating their own publishing platforms. What did I mean by that quote? I think that there was a time in marketing when things were a lot simpler. You could put out a message and you could vet the message very carefully and control it very carefully and say, this is what we stand for, period, full stop. Today, it doesn't work that way because I can tell you that you're the most important thing to my company, the customer's number one, but if I don't listen to what customers are saying on Twitter, or I don't answer questions, or I don't engage with you in any meaningful way, or address an issue that you've had with a product I'm offering you, then that messaging means nothing, and I've just flushed a bunch of money down the toilet.
Very nice. What Michaela won't tell you is she's one of the most disruptive people in the room, having graduated from Berkeley. All right. We've got two. Nice. Excellent. Okay.
Three, right here.
Three. Oh, damn it, we're in trouble. Okay. All right, so Brian, you had a very short and sweet quote, and I love this, though. There's two sides of disruption, dark and delightful. Quick and to the point, I love that. So introduce yourself and tell us what you meant by that.
Steve Jobs actually said that. No, I'm kidding. So my name is Brian Kramer, and let's see, where do I begin? It started 39 years ago in a small town of San Jose. I'm kidding. I basically run, so Pure Matter is a digital marketing agency that Courtney Smith, who's here, and myself started 13 years ago, where we started as a brand and traditional branding and traditional and digital agency, and now have grown into a boutique, almost global, serving global companies and enterprise companies in the enterprise market. So we work to help companies deliver demand generation, digital technologies, and storytelling through content generation. What I meant by that quote, Todd, which is great, thank you for pulling that up, and thank you for having me here today, by the way.
Of course.
The delightful side and the dark side of disruption, when you take it down to the very basic level of disruption, and you're on your computer, and a pop-up comes up, and it says, would you like to enter your information before proceeding? In other words, we want your email address. That, to me, is annoying and disruption. And anything that you aren't thinking through in that way becomes a I just made up a new word, darkful, a dark instance. And that moment of truth that happens when you have that disruption happen, it turns you away. It turns you away from the brand because you didn't think through those points of entry for the user. And so as you're looking at your products and your services and your brand and everything around it, the delightful things, the unexpected things that come through that you really are endeared towards, that to me is the delightful aspect that you really want to get to know in terms of a brand or a person. So there you have it.
All right, Brian, thank you. Thank you for coming too. And then for Susan. So Susan, I love Susan's quote as well. We were talking about this as the prep. So Susan was reminding me of Peter O'Toole in Lawrence of Arabia and the great scene where Peter O'Toole is holding the match and William Potter says, as he lets it burn down to his fingers, you know, what's the trick? And he says, the trick is not minding so much. And so Susan's quote is, you know, disruption is exactly like that. It's a little bit painful, but it's about not minding so much. All right, so Susan, introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about that quote.
Sure. So I'm Susan Etlinger. I'm an analyst at Altimeter Group, and I focus primarily on big data and analytics and small data too, all sorts of data issues. In fact, what I'm thinking about this year is this notion of data disruption, this notion of different types of data now coming into organizations and creating issues wherever they go. And that could be sensor data, that could be social data, that could be other, new streams of enterprise data, transaction data, telemetry, et cetera. I do a lot of work with organizations. I do, research on one side, and then on the other side, work with organizations who are dealing with the impact of technology disruption. And what I think is kind of interesting about this is that in some ways, what's interesting, for example, to the team within these walls at PARC is, becomes, by the time it hits the business, becomes kind of boring for the technologists. The technologists, this could be, let's say, a 3 to 5 year research horizon, and by the time it hits business, it's painful for business and it's boring for the technologists. So really what happens is I work with companies at the point where they are in pain. And they're in pain because things like data and social technologies and pretty much the economy and all sorts of macroeconomic issues are breaking silos and changing the way that organizations work and causing organizations to have to respond much more quickly than they did in the past. That's inherently painful, and the point of the quote was, it may hurt, but the trick is not minding that it hurts.
Very nice. All right, Susan, thank you. So for the course of conversation, we're going to talk a little bit about the culture of disruption, innovation, how it impacts organizations, and how it impacts brands. And I want to dovetail a little bit of what Susan was just talking about, almost this idea of we live in this bubble of Silicon Valley, right? We're all about disruption. It's almost a buzzword here. And we're all about innovation. It's almost a buzzword here. How is it different through the rest of the United States and through the rest of the world? Because we live in this insular society of entrepreneurs and VCs and big thinkers, and we're on the forefront of thinking about technology and technology disruption. But that's not the case around the world and around the US. So we live in this bubble, right? How is the bubble different than the rest of the world? And what's the rest of the world thinking about when they think about all these cool new gadgets and gizmos that we're coming up with? And I'll open it up to any of you three.
Yeah, I mean, I can start. It's interesting because being here as with our location being in San Jose, downtown San Jose, we are actually, I think, more revered or more identified as a company that understands technology than any of the companies around Wisconsin or North Carolina. Well, maybe that's not because they're another Silicon Valley, but another state. And I think that there's still the Silicon Valley kind of buzz or that feeling of people that really identify with what we used to be. I don't think that right now we understand who we are. And so it's kind of this outside-in perspective. But right now, internally, the bubble is interesting because it's starting to turn with the whole social business perspective, and we're starting to get back into it. So we're starting to understand now, again, who we are and where we came from. I think New York is actually another place that's a very social business place, and so it's starting to compete very well with the Silicon Valley bubble, if you will. So I would actually compare the two together. But across the board, I really think that that bubble still exists in other people's minds outside, in the rest of the country and even the world.
Susan, Michaela?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think there's I think about it in concentric circles, right? And not as Silicon Valley being at the hub of things, because I think that's kind of presumptuous, but the idea that it takes time for technologies or innovations to kind of make themselves felt in the world. And if you think about, for example, the advent of television, which was whatever it was, like almost 70 years ago, 70, 80 years ago at this point, you know, the beginning of television was really filming of radio plays because the technology was new and people hadn't really thought about how they could use this new medium in a way that was creative and different. And it took, I think, until I Love Lucy before there was more than one camera in a studio. The idea that you could have a reaction shot. And you know, that was, I think, 1958 or 9. And so at that point, TV is about 10 years old. And so it takes some time for technology advancements to be felt. And I think that, you know, living in San Francisco as I do and seeing all the, you know, all of the protests and everything happening in the city around the buses and stuff, I feel as though one of the challenges that we need to deal with much better as technologists and as people interested in technology is understanding the human impact of the technologies and the culture that we help create.
That's right.
So it's the beginning of the year. Let's give ourselves a clean slate and go for it.
But I want to pivot a little bit off of something you said about television initially being used for radio plays. That is behavior that we see over and over again. So if you look at Twitter, take Twitter, the initial response to Twitter was, oh, I get how to do this. I'm just going to blast a bunch of information out on Twitter, just like I did on other platforms, one-way communication. And it took a while for people to realize that that's not the way Twitter's used at all. In fact, you do that at your expense, potentially, when someone says, basically, I just asked you a question, you didn't answer me, and by the way, I think your messaging sucks. All things that happen on Twitter on a daily basis. So, you know, it takes some time for people to absorb technology, how to use it, how they can use it personally, whether a medium works for them or does not work for them. I think we're at the beginning of it.
Can I, actually, one other thing you just reminded me about when you look at the social impact on where we are, you asked about where we're at location-wise and how we're marketing and how we're actually branding our companies. It's interesting because I think the demographics are actually starting to dissipate online. Because I don't ask people where they are. On Twitter, you can't even see most of the time where they're actually tweeting from unless they've put the location on there, which is almost more rare than not. So I don't think that it's actually about demographics. I think it's now about personographics. So you're looking at where people are talking, what they're talking about, because the reach they have anywhere can personify anywhere else. So there's no more in my backyard. That doesn't exist anymore.
Right.
Well, and I think the thing that's interesting that you've all hit on is that it's the pace, right? It's the pace of change. So I'll go back to Susan's idea of television. It took 10 or 15 years for that evolution. And then it took another 10 or 15 years before it started to evolve there. I don't see that we've got 10 or 15 year gaps in innovation. It's 10 or 15 weeks sometimes before things move, and all of a sudden you're on to the next thing.
Right.
And I know the book is somewhat passé now, and it's almost 45 years old, but you know, Toffler's book on future shock, when he talks about, you know, information overload and this idea that technology dehumanizes us, that things move so quickly, so fast, that we as humans can't keep up with the technology and the innovation, and we become separated from it. We're starting to see some of that today. So do you think there's almost an adverse effect from the pace of disruption that we're becoming disconnected because of all this innovation, disruption, and cultural change that's going on?
Nope.
No.
Okay.
No, I don't.
Next question.
I don't. I mean, look, I do think if you look at, say, for example, 1995, more or less, you know, the internet becomes a business thing.
Right.
To 2005, which is, I think, when Facebook opened up, you know, to people beyond academia, to 2015. you've got these interesting kind of 10-year chunks in which things are happening. There is in fact, my husband's a historian, and he will, if he were here, he would say, every new innovation brings with it a whole bunch of hand-wringing about what's going to happen as a result and how we're going to be dehumanized and how jobs are going to go away. And this has happened since probably somebody made a wheel out of a rock. And I think it will continue to happen throughout history. But in terms of the depersonalization, the information overload thing, I think one of the things that's really interesting that's happening now is innovation around sentiment analysis, around understanding human language, and beyond understanding human language. Lisa Joy is like smiling over there because she's in a company that does that, or has been in a company that does that. And then also things like understanding images, facial recognition. Now, all of these, of course, there's the useful to creepy spectrum that, on the one hand, it's really interesting to be able to say, if you're a brand like Coca-Cola, I want to know every single time a Coke can is shown in an Instagram photo. On the other hand, as a drinker of Diet Coke, do I really want Coke to be tracking every single time I do that? Although I probably don't do it very often, it's something I haven't thought of. So it's a place where the implication hasn't caught up yet with the technology capability. And I think this is not a new problem.
Okay.
I would agree. Yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say, you said, are we becoming more disconnected? Absolutely not. In fact, there are a bunch of us in this room who met online first and developed, bonds and relationships that we nurtured over time, and then met offline and continued working relationships, became colleagues, whatever, co-conspirators, and so on and so forth. And you did an experiment this summer around that, that I think very clearly illustrates that people do form very close connections online that carry into the offline world.
You guys want to know what it is?
I do.
Don't leave us hanging. Right? She gives you that little.
I gave you that layup.
There you go.
This summer, I got together with a friend of mine, and we actually met over social media. So DJ Waldo and I, he's an email guy now. He's an evangelist at Marketo. He and I met for the first time over social media. We were going back and forth. Finally met up and we met with our wives over a couple bottles of wine. That's sort of how some of the good ideas get started, right? And so we were talking about how we can build social media into real-world relationships. How can we prove that social media actually obtains a community of people or one-to-one relationships? And so we started to think about who we could approach in Hollywood. How many people there that we could connect with? We started to talk about people like Justin Timberlake and all kinds of Hollywood stars, and we ended up on Ellen DeGeneres because she was on social media, but she was not unreachable, or she was hard to get to. She had millions of followers and not easy to have some communication with her. So at the end of the day, we started to build this content plan in this blog called 90 Days to Ellen, 90 Days to Ellen, which is still up. And it really started to form, which it goes back to what Michaela was talking about, where the content started to take form by the community. The community started putting ideas into this because they really wanted to see us have lunch with Ellen. We weren't trying to get on her show, we were just actually trying to have lunch with her. And we also tried to get this into the good graces of a nonprofit by giving lunch away by Feed America. So we had them donate in. We got several $1,000s donated by big companies, by all these different companies that were taking part, which I think IBM was a part of it. And at the end of the day, we had over 100 million impressions. It became the content marketing award for the Content Marketing Institute, and it did really well. But the connections that we made during the course of that project were in the thousands, and the people that really came in and took part was what we thought would be the byproduct, but it was actually the main focus. It was the relationships that happened around the campaign. And no, Ellen didn't actually respond. She doesn't reply to anything. She doesn't reply to any tweets or anything on Facebook. So we considered that, we should have considered that before we actually started with Ellen, but the wine took its place and the course was kind of set, so we had to stay with that. But anyway, that's...
Yeah, so more disconnected? No.
Good, okay. Well, then I want to pivot a little bit from some of the macro into the micro. So we've been talking a lot about market factors and what's going on in the real world. But I think one of the things, and as I go out and I talk to companies big and small and interview them about what they're trying to do within their organizations, is this dilemma of how do we really bring about cultural change to create a foundation for disruption, to create a culture of innovation. And it's harder and harder and harder for companies to sort of whitewash innovation. It's harder for companies to say we're all about innovation and then not actually do it. So let's talk a little bit about some practical things that companies need to think about in terms of, again, culture, disruption, innovation, and what do they need to do to be really successful here? Anyone?
In my opinion, it starts at the top. There's just no substitute for having an executive team that says, you go for it. This is what we believe in. And the flip side of that is Gary Vaynerchuk, who's one of the great social evangelists out there, has this great quote where he says, hey, you don't believe in social? Great, I don't want to talk to you because I don't have time to convince you that this is really important. You have to believe that. And so.
But then he goes on to, no, I'm kidding.
For a while.
Well, I do think that it's a question of talking the talk and walking the walk. And what that means is that if you have an organization where it's a very flat hierarchy and you are, in fact, building collaboration networks inside your organization and you are crowdsourcing innovation with your users and you are encouraging people to form sub-communities and to drive new products in the market or new services or new ways of thinking and to challenge the old world order, you're in great shape. But I really struggle with the idea that you can change the culture in a company if your top executives are not behind it.
I think that's true. I mean, but I think that's true with a caveat, which is that, I see some of the most innovative things going on in organizations where you would never guess, like a true retail bank. Who's going to think, oh, center of innovation is a retail bank? But, what's happened is that they've created a culture in which learning is an acceptable outcome. And not everything is performance-based. And not only is learning an acceptable outcome, it's a demanded outcome. What did you learn from this? Mm-hmm. And what will you do next time? And I think, what I'm seeing, too, from the grassroots level, in addition to the top down, is that if there's enough of a culture of experimentation, bounded experimentation, scientific experimentation, the idea that you have a desired outcome, you have a hypothesis, and you test against that, and then you kind of go from there. I do see really interesting things happening. And the other thing that I think seeds that is a cross pollination among groups, because one of the things that whatever innovation with the big I actually creates is a lot of silo breakage in organizations. Because if something is innovative to one department, it's going to be highly disruptive to another. And you think about something like social, innovation for marketing, a huge pain in the butt for risk management. So,
right.
And then risk management says, oh, well, gosh, actually what's happened is now we see all these fraud examples that we never saw before. We're catching fraud. Symantec had this issue where they, it's a security company. How open do you think they're going to be to social media or to that kind of outside-in communication? And then the risk team discovered that they were finding fraud instances that they would never have found otherwise. All of a sudden, they're huge proponents. So I do think that kind of unintended consequence is really important to fostering a culture of, at least of learning.
Yeah, and permission to fail. So, if you give me the charge to come up with a big idea, we'll probably come up with a big idea, but that idea might fail, and that should be okay. Otherwise, you're going to stifle this curiosity that you need in order to drive constant innovation.
There's so many different angles you can go with that question. So because I agree with exactly what you guys are saying, but so I'm going to take the employee approach here, and I think that there's so many innovations happening at the call it mid-level area, or even at bottom up, and those innovations are being passed now with social business. They should be rising up. We should be seeing them in communication, and just kind of a story behind that and how I kind of view the value and innovation of employees goes back to just like jobs that we've all held in our lives. I mean, raise your hand if you had a job in high school or college, one, that you did not like. Right. So now I fucking hated every job I had. I couldn't last at any job because they weren't innovating anything. There was I had to do a Togo sandwich in 30 seconds. You really want to eat that? And so after a while, you're like, is there any company for me? Will I last? Will I actually get a job when I get out of college? I don't know about this. And when I went into college, I ended up becoming in like 15 jobs later, in a period of a year, I became a pizza delivery driver for Domino's. And I was like, okay, I can make tips. I'm gonna make a lot of money doing this. And I didn't. They didn't give me a lot of tips. They would pay me 50 cents, and sometimes I'd get stiffed on a tip. And I'd have to figure out a way to deliver value or be innovative. And so one day I was at Safeway and I saw a pallet of Coke and Diet Coke, and I was like, 50 cents for 2 bottles, which is $0.25 a piece. So I took the whole pallet, I bought the whole thing, put it in my '84 Chevy Blazer, and I delivered a 2-liter for a medium or larger for free. And I passed it out, and they gave me $5 and $10 back. And I was like, holy crap, this shit works. Value actually works. So now I'm like making $400 and $500 a night. I'm rich, right? So then I get called in the office a month and a half later, my longest job, and I went back into the office, and they said I had to stop because they got calls from other drivers from the other people saying they weren't getting their 2 liters. And I was like, okay, well, you guys should be doing this. We need to be innovating, right? And they made me stop, and I had to quit my job because I couldn't go back to $10 an hour. And I think that, that's not to say that that happens all the time in where we work, but I do think that the ideas exist kind of down there, and we just need to find a way to bring them up.
Yeah. Well, I think it also brings up one of the inherent conflicts in organizations, especially large organizations, where you've got the differentiation, the layer between the top and the bottom of the organization, right? You've got everyone at the bottom that can now be connected with social, can hear ideas from other companies, from other thought leaders, and they can start to bring that into their organizations, and they're desperate for innovation. They want to create that change. They want to be at the forefront of it. But if you have a layer of culture at the top of the head of the organization that's not right for that, there's natural conflict there. Now, if you're in an organization where everyone top down, bottoms up, all believe in a culture of innovation, it works great. But I think it's even harder today because now you've got so much information. Brian's idea, right, while that was a fun story and a singular example, can be replicated around the globe because people can hear about that and go, I want to do something just like that too, and build off of that at a scale faster and quicker than we've ever been able to do before. Mm-hmm. So it does create this conflict, and I think people are really struggling with, okay, how do I get that idea through my organization? How do I get that through my my executive layer that's maybe not quite there yet? Any thoughts, ideas?
You got to prove it. I mean, the thing is, the reason that executives are executives is that they're hard to convince, and they require a high burden of proof, and that's as it should be, because you can't just, as much as I love all this fun stuff, you can't just accept every crackpot idea that comes your way. And so I do think business cases are critical, but I do think that writing a business case with the idea that we're not going to generate, $800 million of revenue in the first quarter on this, but, here are the market forces, here are the statistics that support it, here's what we intend to learn, here's how we intend to integrate what we've learned, and here are the here are the success criteria. Then you start to see it, and I've seen this in I believe in incremental innovation. I think it's a good thing. Unless you happen to be working at Zappos for Tony Hsieh, the rest, what does that mean? The rest of us are screwed? No, it means that we have to go, we have to know our executives well enough to find the thing. If they're a numbers person, if they're a self-marketer and they want to be known as an innovator and you help support that, there are lots of different ways to do this. And so I think we need to problem solve. And I also, I have to say, I'm not a fan of the fail fast philosophy because I don't like the word fail. The reason, the thing I like about it is that, yes, you learn something and you move on, but to me the value is not the failure, the value is the learning. So back to my old hobby horse.
And I also think you need to have enough insight into your organization and the executive you're dealing with to understand what battle you're going to pick, right? So for a long time, people would say, you can't measure the return on investment in social media. Well, maybe you're measuring the wrong thing. Maybe you're not starting with a business problem you're trying to solve. So for example, what if you were to say, hey, let's move customer service and customer support to social, and let's measure whether we have a decrease in calls to our 800 number. Let's measure whether we have an increase in customer satisfaction. Is that something that you can sell to your execs? Maybe. And if it is, that's a great way for you to get into the social game.
No comment? No, I think that everybody is an influencer on something, and everyone within an organization everywhere influences something. And what that is, hopefully you're in the right position or you're in the right job to influence that. Because if your passion isn't there to influence it, you're never going to influence it. I mean, that's classic case of you're fighting a wall that you don't have the passion for to fight. So that's the first case. And I mean, you can kind of look at it as like when you're at a baseball game or you're at a football game, and I mean, how many here have been involved in one of those waves, you know, where everybody stands up and they, right? Everyone's shaking their heads. So, and if I were to start that now and do it, it would take me probably a couple times to get you guys to do it, because you'd be like, what the hell is this guy doing? And finally,
well,
I think we can get.
For it.
Can we do it? No, I'm kidding. And I think it's the same thing. You know, sometimes it's really hard to get that wave started, and then sometimes it really takes off. Mm-hmm. And when it really takes off, sometimes it'll end just one time around, and you're like, I wonder why it went one time around. And sometimes it'll just keep going. I've been at one game where it went on 10 times, and I'm like, what the heck just happened? This is awesome. I'm part of it. Woo! And so this is kind of what you need from whoever that evangelist or influencer is, that person that really influences something, that's passionate about something, that can start the wave. If they can do that with they're passionate about their job, with the person they're working for, I think they can influence anything.
Yeah. Well, and this is one of the things that I candidly love about bringing the three of you together for this was you've all been successful disruptors and innovators in your own right? You did it at Google. You started an agency from the ground floor. You were helping to help steer and guide hundreds, if not thousands, of organizations around this idea of big data, small data, data in general, right? And you've all had successes in doing it. And what I think is really important, and what we've heard from a lot of different companies, is that struggle to really find innovation. And you're all coming back and saying there needs to be some discipline and some rigor behind it. It's the marriage of art and science. It's not just about chaos. It's not about disruption for disruption's sake, but it's really finding a business strategy, building a business case, and then finding that lever, right, that thing to use with your executives to get them to start thinking about what you're passionate about and help them see your vision. And I think a lot of us have struggled in the past of just beating our heads against the wall trying to find their way through that, and you've all been very successful in doing so. So that's, I think, the great thing about having you on this panel today.
Thank you, Todd.
Thank you.
All right, we're done.
Thank you.
All right, we've got about 15 minutes left or so, and I want to open it up for a couple of questions, and then we can always go and ask a couple more things of our panelists. But let's open it up. Any questions off the bat? We'll go with this gentleman right over here.
Are the people over 50 who have all this baggage of the way they've done things all their lives, are they dead in the water?
Speaking, okay, so we're in a safe place, right? You're not going to tweet this, but speaking as somebody who's over 50, no.
Yes.
So there you go.
No,
There you go.
I mean, look, I do think, and I have friends who are much younger who have a much harder time with technology and are much less interested in technology. And of course, my 10-year-old son was using Google when he was 4. So, like, who knows, right? I think that the biggest thing that stops us is fear of looking stupid. And one thing I've tried to do in my life is not care if I look stupid. And that's actually one of the hardest things I've ever done because I got to a certain point in my career, and I had been doing marketing and corporate communications and stuff like that for a long time, and I was really bored. And I was just bored with what I was doing, and I wanted to do something different, so I made a career change in my 40s. And saw the social thing happening, which has led me to other areas. But really candidly, I mean, the reason that I got into it was that my son's got autism, and I wanted to find people online who had kids who were kind of similar to mine, because I couldn't find them in my own community. I didn't know who to talk to, and it's not like you can't just walk up to people and say, so, you know, who do you know? So for me, and then I from there I sort of discovered, well, if this is interesting for this particular use of finding a community online I can talk to, then maybe this could be really interesting for business. And so I started to kind of apply it. So I think, I'm, I'm not that much over 50, but I do think that, again, please, give me a break.
It's being recorded.
I know, it's a youth culture, but, hopefully we're all in a safe place here. I really do believe that it needs to be okay for everybody. And my 85-year-old father is still trying to figure out how to add an attachment to an email, and God bless him for that.
I would say that I don't think that, and I'm just speaking merely on just a social media level, that everybody needs to be on it. I think no matter the age you are, I think some people just should not be on it because they're not into it. And they're always trying to say, I want to figure this out, I want to be on it, how do I figure that, how do I communicate, why don't I get this tweeter thing? What do I do with it? If you don't want to do it, don't do it, because there's a network for everybody, I think, at this point. There's 750 networks out there. So there's a network for everyone. It's just a matter of finding what fits you. And that's not age specific. That's who you are as a person. I would never recommend for one person to be on every single network. So that I think is really important, because everybody that learns how to share, like on Facebook, I'm connected to my family. Now I could kill myself for doing that, because they see everything. But they're on it to see what I'm doing, and little did they know they're actually learning how to use it, because they just wanted to see the pictures about my kids or what's going on. So now I got to figure that out. But anyway, I think that's kind of how I see it.
Yeah, I would agree.
Well, and it does seem like every day there's a new technology, there's a new platform, there's a new medium to use. And you then hear these stories on CNN or wherever else about, the millennials are doing this and the teens are doing this. And if we're in a state and place in our time in our lives where that kind of communication is not important to us, we feel left out. And I don't think that matters what your age is, if you're over a certain limit or not. I think that's important to them, but not necessarily important to us for what our goals and objectives are in our lives. So I've given up trying to be on every single technology platform that's out there, because there's some things I'm just not going to do. Right? Mm-hmm. Snapchat may be the greatest thing since sliced bread. I'm not a Snapchat guy. It's just not going to happen.
Yeah, I have 10 unopens from you.
I know.
I
yeah, and that's why. All right, we had this gentleman right over here.
With social media adoption the way it is going, and where they have the flexibility to share anything about the brand, what are some strategies for brand protection?
Brand protection?
Yeah, because now it's all open communication, right? We are not controlling the information. Yeah. So how do we protect the brand?
I have a couple quick things. First is every organization needs governance policies and processes. So there needs to be, and if you think about healthcare, for example, pharma companies with HIPAA requirements and financial services companies with FINRA requirements, a lot of the policies from the FDA or the guidance from the FDA and the guidance from FINRA are translated for the social world at this point, and that's good. The other thing is that there are technologies that are being developed with business rules. So for example, if you, there's a company that actually, or there's several companies that have business rules involved. So if you are blogging or tweeting or something on behalf of a brand and you include the words guaranteed in return in the same tweet, it will stop you and either send that back to somebody to review it or ask you to rephrase what it is that you're saying. So it doesn't catch everything, and as we know from all the kind of ridiculousnesses that happen when people use the F word and they think that they're using it on their personal account and they're using it on their corporate account. I mean, it doesn't catch everything, but it does catch profanity, it does catch words that words or phrases. So, but the bottom line is that the people need to be trained and the people need to understand what their responsibilities are when they're speaking on behalf of a brand.
Yeah. Absolutely. I think that's exactly right. Governance is key. A clear escalation policy is key. A crisis comms policy is key. And understanding that people are human, so they're going to make mistakes. And also, it's important to bear in mind that the landscape is shifting. So for example, this morning there was a ruling from the court that what you post on Twitter can actually be libelous. It turns out that this is a ruling against Courtney Love. She defamed her attorney, allegedly. And this attorney is proceeding with action, and the court has ruled that what you say on Twitter is actually being held to the same standard as what you say in print. So, the law is evolving as much as the technology is innovating, although it's behind it. But I do think that governance and escalation policies and crisis comms and proper training are all critical.
Well, and I think one of the things that goes with that too is it really comes down to risk mitigation and an understanding of your risk policies as a brand. So I look at, I'm from SAP, 40-year company, conservative, German roots. Most people wouldn't think of this as the most progressive organization on the planet. But the reality is we've now moved the conversation from just 4 or 5 executives at the top to a whole host of subject matter experts, and now we have hundreds of people that are out there personalizing and humanizing the brand, and I'm one of them. And so you have this opportunity to create these great relationships and to scale the experience for your brand by using these social tools. And we weigh that against the risks of someone uses the F word when they're coming home drunk one night and they think they're using a different account, or someone puts guaranteed in return and
I didn't mean to do that. Sorry.
I know you didn't. We caught you. But you weigh that against those risks, and then you make some decisions on behalf of your brand. Mm-hmm. And there's not a one brushstroke decision for all brands. All brands have to make that decision about what are they going to do to allow their employees to actually get out and have those communications versus what are you going to do to have some risk mitigation. Some lean towards we're going to try and lock everything down. Others try and be more open, and then you become flexible and fine-tune it.
Yeah. I would totally agree with all of that. I would just say that just on the human level of your question and what to do if something actually happens, if you aren't timely and it lasts for days and you don't respond, you're screwed. So you have to have that plan in place to know what you're going to do almost immediately. And I was in a debate last week on who owns. On stage in the debate, not with somebody, and we were actually talking about. I don't know why I needed to explain that to you guys. We were talking about whether PR or marketing owns social media within a company, and it's a really interesting debate because it's not quite grasped yet in terms of who does. But I think in what you just asked, PR does because they're trained to communicate, and marketing people aren't trained to externally communicate on a social platform yet. They will be, or they are starting to be, but that's a PR function, and I think that it happens all the time. Like when you look at the Marriott Hotel down south, when they had a placard that got tweeted like thousands of times because it said, "We're giving away free coffee for 45 minutes in honor of 9/11." And it got tweeted like thousands of times. They didn't respond for 2 days because either they weren't listening, they didn't know what to do, whatever.
The lawyers told them not to.
Yeah.
And it hurt them so badly because if they actually responded and just said, what they actually said 2 days later was perfect. They said it sooner, they would have probably mitigated all thousands of tweets going out. So anyway. It was a paragraph which I don't, but I'll paraphrase it. It said, we were trying to honor it and be nice and hopefully do something nice because we feel like this is something that we wanted to take on as a brand. We're sorry if that appeared in a way that we didn't intend it. So it was heartful. It was honest. It was authentic. It came across well, and it stopped. Actually, the tweet stopped right after that. So it almost, like to my point, it actually does work. You just have to be timely about how you actually respond.
Yeah, just really quickly, one of my favorite stories is the FedEx story. And people might remember this of the driver taking the 42-inch big screen TV and throwing it over the fence at Christmas time about 2 years ago. FedEx came out with a response by one of their executives, and this is an operations manager. He's not a public speaker. You could tell he was nervous. He had sweat on the upper lip, and he just was not coming across as like a professional PR person, but he was the person in charge of those drivers worldwide. And he came out and gave a very heartfelt apology within 24 hours and said, basically, we've got 200,000 employees. Every once in a while, we hire a complete you know, and you throw your own word in there. And it happens, and we're wholly sorry. We've made restitution with the owners. We're doing what we can to address the problem, and we're going to give corrective counseling to this individual. And their stock price took a dip. It was down 10% the day it happened. It was back up 15% after the apology. And it took off after that because people felt like the brand really responded and they respected the issue, and they came out and they took ownership for it instead of hiding behind it like they used to. Now, you can only do that so many times, right? If they're apologizing every week, then you know that there's a fundamental problem. But they came out.
Schedule it.
Yeah, just schedule. We're sorry. We're sorry. We're sorry. It goes out every Friday. But they took ownership of it, and I think that's one of the keys that we're coming up with here is if a mistake happens, you take ownership and you move on. All right, we had a gentleman up in the corner had a question.
Yeah, so Brian, I think you said earlier, innovation happens all the time, and I do agree with that. Disruptive innovation, though, is much rarer when it happens, and I'd love to get the panel's perspective. I think there's a high degree of correlation between the size of a business and their ability to roll out disruptive innovation. Would you agree, which would then mean that Todd and Michaela have to explain why SAP and IBM aren't disruptive innovators as much as just incremental innovation?
Oh, get down here. Oh, that's it. Those are fighting words.
Can you elaborate?
Okay, so I think the question, all joking aside, was it really comes down to the size of innovation, the size of your organization, and your ability to innovate. And a smaller, more nimble organization will be more likely or find it easier to be disruptive than a larger, more established institution. Is that okay? Anyone?
Well, I disagree. You know what? I think that you can slice that question any number of ways, but I think you'd be hard-pressed to say that we're not driving massive innovation. Look at what we just announced around Watson. I think that is extremely compelling to the business world, and I think that bringing big data and operationalizing its use and driving it more deeply into the enterprise is a very potentially disruptive type of innovation. But I do think that innovation comes from everywhere. And I think it would be wrong to say that it only comes from large organizations. For example, if you take iTunes, I don't think that Apple was exactly a small organization when they introduced iTunes. And the initial thought behind iTunes, the genius of it, was the realization that you want to own your media, you want to own your songs, you want to own your relationship with the label in a way that you couldn't do when you had to buy the entire CD or what have you. And that single thought, in my opinion, then led to all kinds of other innovations from the iPod, the iPhone, the iPad, and so on and so forth. But it has led to the realization that we are all our own owners of media, that we consume media differently, that the same model of my picking out the song that I like on a CD and buying it on iTunes plays out in the press, because I can go to Twitter and read the articles that I want to read without having to thumb through the whole of the New York Times like I used to have to do 10 years ago, right? So I think innovation comes from everywhere, up to and including SAP and IBM.
And Pure Matter and Altimeter Group.
Absolutely.
Okay.
No question.
Yeah, I honestly don't have much to add to that. I think, I do think that culture plays a huge role. And I've seen companies of 5 people that have a hard time getting an idea out the door. And then companies of 50,000 who can do it on schedule. So I do think culture has a role to play. But where I see it is, to me, innovation isn't really that innovative unless it is disruptive, because the point is that it needs to change the way that you do things. And iTunes changed the way that we do things, and all these other many other technologies have changed the way that we do things, and sometimes we don't know that except in retrospect.
Mm-hmm.
And just real quickly, I add that I also think that there's this you need to look at it in the perspective of the shift that's made within every organization, no matter their size. So if you're looking at the shift that needs to be made within a small, medium, or large business, it's almost, I call it like the 1 degree shift. So a 1 degree shift for a large business is millions of dollars, I mean, a lot of business. So, you know, you really can change at any level with that kind of a shift mentality going on. And I agree with everything that you guys are saying too. But
Okay, we're nearing the end, and we had a couple more questions come up. So I want this gentleman here, and then down here.
Yeah, so Peter Drucker a long time ago wrote about the 5 deadly business sins, one of which is the unwillingness to cannibalize your own business. And it would seem that large companies have a much harder time cannibalizing their base businesses in the interest of innovation, whereas small companies can go out and be disruptive because they don't have this installed base and revenue stream to protect. Could you comment on the differences there and whether large companies are still ignoring Drucker's advice?
Yeah, well, I'll give one really quick example just from SAP. So we've moved from this idea of on-premise big installations of ERP onto a cloud-based system. And what we've had to do is actually move away. Our revenues have come down. Our software licensing revenues have come down because we've moved away from these large established on-premise deals and moved to a cloud-based, subscription-based model. And that model has caused us to be completely disruptive within our own culture, completely disruptive with our customers, and completely disruptive in the marketplace. But it's a necessity for us to grow, and we're actually seeing a brighter horizon because we've taken that bold step. I'm not just saying that this is SAP that does it. I think companies do this all the time. But there are some classic examples of big companies that have decided not to do that to their peril. And every year you see this on Forbes, you see the 10 brands that are now going the way of the dodo, right? And we could name them off here, and I don't want to embarrass any companies, but we've all seen those companies that were iconic brands for 10 years, and now they're no longer with us. And that's because they've refused to innovate, and they've refused to move the needle, and they've refused to cannibalize themselves. It's a great, great question.
Yeah, it's kind of fraught with some interesting stories. I mean, it made me, your comment made me immediately think of Netflix. You know, and when Netflix was started, I always forget the name of the CEO because I always confuse him with Reed. Hoffman, not the other Reed. Okay.
Right.
So, and he said, you know, there's a reason we didn't call the company DVDs by mail. But at the time, networks couldn't actually handle streaming. It took many, many years, and if you think back a couple of years ago, they tried to break the business up. And that was kind of a big mess. And you know, I have a lot of respect for them for having done that incredibly stupid thing because number one, it gave them a really quick sense with that stock price correction and a whole bunch of other data about what would happen if they moved too quickly. And at the same time, I think it also probably enabled them to learn a little bit more about what they would need to do in order to facilitate that transition. And now I think they're nominated for Golden Globes for actually creating their own content.
Yeah.
So I think that's a kind of a great story because they had their bumps and bruises along the way, but they've managed to do it. And they're not the biggest company in the world, but they're certainly not tiny.
So unfortunately, we've gone over, and we had a couple more questions, but we are going to be here for another half an hour. We'll be standing around answering questions as we have some snacks out in the foyer. But I want to thank everyone here for great questions, great interaction, and I particularly want to thank Michaela, Brian, and Susan for coming in and sharing their insights. I want to thank the folks at PARC. I want to thank Anna and Heather for having us here this evening. And then we'll let you go ahead and close it up and talk about what's coming up next.
Okay. I just want to make sure to let everyone know that you're invited to our next forum in February. Dr. Robert Sutton will be in to talk about the new book that he's co-authored called Scaling Up Excellence. I'd also like to invite you all to take a look at PARC's new Innovation Lab. This is new innovation training that we'll be providing here at PARC with our inaugural session in March. And we'd invite you to check it out, and please look at attending.